Welcome to Chapter 7, Women in an Expanding Nation, Consolidation of the West, Mass Immigration, and the Crisis of the 1890s. The consolidation of the West in the 19th century was this time period of continuation of the expansion of white settlement from that of manifest destiny. The growth of the Continental Railroad system fed into this booming national market. There was a need for the production of farmers' produce, and this led to an expanse in the transcontinental Mississippi West. And so the consolidation of the West, as said before, dealt with white settlers seizing Native American land, culture, and religion. And Zakalasa, who I have pictured here to the right at the top, spoke out against this injustice for her people. It was in her writings that she showed that the removal of Native American religion, of the peyote religion, was an injustice to her people because these Christian priests who were forcing her people to take on this religion, in fact, she viewed as the savage. And she felt that to force Christianity on her people when they already had a religion was an injustice, it was wrong. Furthermore, she was an advocate for the redress of land settlement for her people, and also the preservation of her people's history, which was being taken away by the white settlers. And so I have two pictures here. To the left, you see these children, they're wrapped up. They're in their just natural element as Native American children. Once they were seized and forced to go to boarding school, these young girls were forced to give up or relent their culture and the way they dressed for that of white culture. They had to be domestic and learn how to sew. Furthermore, what we see in the chapter is something known as the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. The act divided reservation lands into allotments for individual Native families. At first, it was meant to be an alternative to this demeaning reservation land for the Native Americans, but actually, it ended up being just as bad because the land that was given to the Native Americans was not fertile, but the land that was given to the whites was fertile. It also reinforced women's dependency on men to follow the pattern of white society. And this is because men controlled the land and economic aspect of their relationship. So just to continue from the last slide, you see even more so, even with this governmental act, or even with the boarding school, or even with the other things we've talked about thus far, that this white settlement was depraving the Native Americans of their heritage in all different kinds of aspects, even personal relationships between men and women. As Native Americans lost control over the West, a diverse group of women and families encouraged by the Homestead Act of 1862 were drawn to the West. What was the Homestead Act of 1862? Long story short, the government granted 160 acres to people who were willing to cultivate the land. Furthermore, railroads sold land to settlers to start towns. So let's just pause for a second and let's explain a little bit more about the railroads. So you have to understand, really try to picture it. Unlike today in our modern world, where we can take an airplane and go from one place to another place in a matter of hours, or hop the train to go to from New Jersey to New York or wherever it might be. This was not the case in North America until this time period of the 19th century. Traveling quickly, somewhat cheaply and fast, it was unheard of until the time period of industrialization, when steam technology was being perfected and people were coming together, and you have these engineers developing, and wow, the railroad system, this was all new. Imagine it. Imagine, you got to remember that North America, this country was new, was still coming together. Lands were still being fought for and taken over by others. And so the railroad system, known as the Transcontinental Railroad, was a railroad line that connected the United States from the east to the west. It was promoted by acts of Congress, through issuing government bonds, but also by giving grants of land to railroad companies. So, in other words, these railroad companies ended up owning that land thanks to the government. And so when we say that the railroad sold the land to settlers to start new town, well, what are you talking about, the railroad? We're talking about the railroad companies that now owned the land because they were basically contracted by the government to do so. So go back into your history, and if you need to, go back into the book about the Transcontinental Railroad, because that is what we're referring to right here, just to clarify a little bit. The Homestead Act of 1862 also allowed immigrants who promised to become citizens this 160 acres as well to cultivate their land. So we see that African American women, when it comes to this time period, were small in number, but they too were drawn to the West. In all black towns, like in Nicodemus, Kansas, or Langston, Oklahoma, black women were taking on all sorts of professions as a way to support their family, but they were alternatives to being domestic help. So we have dressmaking, boarding houses, even catering food. Anything to support their family, but was not anything reminiscent to what they did when they had been enslaved. We also have immigrant women who come to North America with this hope of this new world, a new start, a new life. And so, like I told you before, the Homestead Act extended to these immigrant families. And so we see immigrant women, whether they were Hispanic, Irish, the list goes on, who settled in possibly New Mexico or Arizona or South California. And these immigrant women formed their own communities and ran their farms the way they saw fit. They lived their lives and brought their cultures with them from these different communities from which they left and they immigrated to here. And so here we are going to talk about Western women. Western women, I would like to say, were this continuation of the women that you read about from a previous chapter regarding the Oregon Trail. So the Oregon Trail was a time period in which pioneers went into their wagons, very primitive, with horses drawing them, and about 500,000 pioneers took the journey to go to Oregon essentially in search of gold or in search of new wage earning opportunities. And so women took this long 2,000-mile journey. And what did they do? Well, most of them gave birth on the trail. Bumpy, long, hot trail. Because they were either just starting their families or continuing their families. Very, very rough. I can't imagine myself, I'm pregnant for the third time, giving birth on the Oregon Trail. Bumpy, long time. There wasn't an epidural back then. Okay, so very, very difficult time. Women were in charge of collecting the wood, making the food, taking care of the kids, taking care of the men, milking the cows, hauling the water. You get the point. So the women who did these duties on the Oregon Trail, I would like to say the same could be extended to Western women of this, time period. They were doing the domestic duties like taking care of the kids and the husband and growing the food and making the dinner and caring for the animals and doing the laundry, and the list goes on and on and on. This was not a simple life. It was a rough life. They lived a life of loneliness. Monotony, and they were they were forced to serve in their homes without a husband present most of the time because the husband wasn't there. He was out doing his job. Okay, again, not an easy time period for these women. And so what you see is the development of the National Grange, established in 1867. It was also known, just for your reference, as the Order of the Patrons of Husbandry. This group was formed partially to help overcome women's isolation. So a lot of these Western families came together, they held social events and parties, and it helped the women to overcome their isolation and loneliness. But also, the purpose of it was for farm families to fight corporate power of the railroads and other corporate monopolies that were committing many injustices against their husbands who were working for them. And so the National Grange spoke out against this corporate power by establishing farmer-run businesses, not corporate-run businesses. This was meant to fight for the rights of the farmer. You should take note of this. Women in the National Grange served in high positions. So some of these women, for example, served as officers, even others as delegates on the national stage. So, just as it was unusual for farmer women to serve in dominant roles in the National Grange, the same could be true of unmarried women who took up homesteading. Approximately 15% of these women tried homesteading on their own, meaning that they were given this 160 acres of land to settle by themselves. And believe it or not, it led to a lot of proposals by men who were attracted to them and the fact that they had land. So men saw this as their opportunity to marry into owning land, but also having this woman who had knowledge of how to work the land. Okay, again, I want to emphasize that women in homesteading, this was not typical, but it did occur. So as I go through our lecture, I'm going to start talking about the Wild West women. I'm going to give you some generalizations. Some women that were the exception to the rule, like Annie Oakley or Chicago Joe. And there's other things I'm going to reference. So before I get to those slides, I want to make clear so we all understand that there's a difference between the Western women from what I just lectured about to the Wild West women. If you read the chapter, you'll understand more, so hopefully you read this before you viewed the lecture. Western women, okay, it was more so common for Western, these what we call the quote-unquote Western women mothers to be domestic on a whole. The quote-unquote Wild West women, it was basically less common for them to be in the domestic sphere. They did some other things. You know, did it pertain to domesticity? Yes, but they were making money. We do see similarities between the quote-unquote Western women and the quote-unquote Wild West women. We have some exceptions to the rule. Homesteaders, who were women in these quote-unquote Western women category, were the exception to the rule of remaining in the domestic sphere, meaning it was not commonplace, but it did happen. Same with the Wild West women. We have some exceptions to the rule, and that would be Annie Oakley, and I'm going to talk about her in a little bit. So as we continue through the lecture, just be aware that if I reference Western women or Western mothers or the homesteaders, I'm referring back to the previous slides of the quote-unquote Western women. So now that we've talked about women in we just called them the Western women, we're going to shift our attention to the Wild West. So in your textbook, the Wild West refers to the cowboys and the miners that brought with them capitalism, wage labor, and subordination to the growing power of the different industries that almost kind of like owned them, as well as the women of the Wild West. So families that were drawn west to settle the land became self-sufficient, economically self-sufficient, and the women of this Western culture that we talked about before were more domestic. That couldn't be any more different than our Wild West women, and the first of which is Phoebe Ann Moses, or better known as Annie Oakley. So it was very, very uncommon for someone like Annie Oakley to be what we would call today a cowgirl. So I want you to please, please, please comprehend that cowgirls of pop culture is just that. It really, truly was not a commonality back in this time period. So Annie Oakley was like one of a kind. With that said, her upbringing was very difficult. After her father died when she was only 6, she was left with her mother and 7 sisters and brothers. Her mom would go on to marry and divorce 3 times. Because her family was in poverty, her mom sent her away, and she was adopted, and her adopted parents treated her terribly and actually abused her. So she ran away, and what she knew, what she was familiar with was hunting and shooting. So she started hunting and shooting at a very young age. She was about 7 when she started this. And so she took this love of shooting and hunting, and she used it for a profit. She actually hunted game, she sold it at the market, and she took this money and used it to support her family. In fact, she made enough money to pay off the mortgage for her family's home. So, we have this competition that occurred between Annie Oakley and the famous Frank Butler. So, there had been a very famous traveling entertainment show that went around the West, debuting their star Frank Butler. And Frank Butler was like one of the best shooters there ever were. So, just like I'm trying to think today, what you have like the circus that goes around, and you would see the animals do tricks, and the tightrope walker and whatnot. Same kind of concept, except this entertaining show that traveled was about sharpshooting. So there had been a bet placed that the young Annie Oakley, I believe she was only 15, was set up to compete against Frank Butler, who was much older than her. Well, it turns out that Annie Oakley actually won, and not only won the bet, so he missed the shots by 25 times to this young 15-year-old, but he ended up falling in love with her and marrying her. And they went on to star together in Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. Take everything that you know of the typical Wild West, your cowboys, riding the horses, Native American chiefs, buffalo, cowboys, cowgirls, the list goes on. That's what you would see at a wild Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. It was everything that you would typically see of the Wild West. But the thing that was most unusual is you have Annie Oakley, which I have depicted here to the right. She was the star. She was loved. She was adored by the people. She dressed very modestly, but she was doing something that was very unmodest for that time, and that was shooting and showing off her skills. So here I'm going to hopefully, maybe not. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm going to play a clip of the actual real Annie Oakley showing off her skills so you can see what that looked like. And this was recorded in New Jersey, believe it or not. So here she goes. So no wonder she was. Another type of woman that was more common was the prostitute. And here we have Josephine Airy, better known as Chicago Joe, who was a prostitute herself, but ended up becoming a businesswoman as a madam, and in other ways she got business of all kinds. And so she began opening up dance clubs of all sorts, not like a dance club like you would think of today, wink wink, more like a promiscuous type of dance club for gentlemen. She ended up also entering the real estate business. So there had been a fire that destroyed homes, in which she bought the homes from the people whose homes were destroyed because they couldn't afford to repair the homes. And she could, because she had this money from her dance clubs. So she dabbled in real estate, and she took these homes and she made them into very popular brothels. And she even built her own vaudeville theater, where burlesque was very popular and whatnot. she took her money and she donated it to political campaigns and even charities. So while she was known as Chicago Jo, she took on the name Josephine Airy, and then it became commonplace to call her Chicago Jo because that's where she set up her business. So while Chicago Jo made prostitution into a business, for most it came with a price, and that was loss of life. Prostitution, it was very dangerous because they were sleeping with all sorts of men. They didn't have knowledge back then, really, of STDs. And it also brought women into dangerous situations in which there could be homicide. An angry lover shoots the prostitute. Suicide for those prostitutes who couldn't handle it psychologically. Alcoholism, and even abortions. So our third type of Wild West woman is the Wild West wives. Cowboys and miners took up jobs, like we said before, in the Wild West, and their wives usually took jobs in the domestic sphere. So these women would do things in the domestic sphere like feed and house other people, or they would even be like serve food or whatnot to the bosses of their husbands. So Wild West wives, unlike the other wives we talked about of families of the West, were actually working in a sense. What they also did was they supported the unions because they wanted to fight for the rights of their husbands. So, for example, we have the 1893 Western Federation of Miners. This was established initially in Colorado, and it merged all types of miners from Montana to Idaho to Colorado to South Dakota, even to Utah. Their most famous success was the strike of 1894. The mine owners wanted to have their workday cut because it was too long. It was about 10 hours long and they wanted it to be cut to 8. And so they took this radical position. They actually set dynamite to the building where they mined into the equipment. Conflict ensued between the workers and those who supported the owners. It ended up that the strike of 1894, led by the Western Federation of Miners, was a success. The workers got their 8-hour day, their work day, and they got a pay increase. And this led to the Western Federation of Miners to actually expand to these other places that I said before. Populism was a political movement that emerged in response to the wealthy elitist class that controlled the industrial sector. Just to give you a little bit of background, there had been a boom and bust cycle in the economy in the 1890s, and this led to the discontent and the suffering of factory workers who were laid off or had a pay decrease, and farmers who suffered greatly. And so populism was in response to this. And the immigrants who came to America, who served as factory workers and as farmers, saw their glittering American dream kind of die out. And it was very disheartening for them to see that happen. And so women suffragists saw their opportunity, and here they are at the polling place. They realized that they too were suffering, and they too were discontented, and that's because women did not have certain rights. And so we see that women become active with the populist movement. They expose the hardships of workers, and they help to lead strikes. By doing this, suffragists connected their fight for the women's rights with that of struggling farmers and wage earners by asking for women's right to vote as a way to fight against the entrenched power of those who held ownership over the railroads, who held ownership over the mining corporations, and who ultimately held ownership over the worker. Okay, so down below, the picture here is actually showing these Western suffragists voting. The fact that these suffragists combined their efforts with the populist movement meant that they connected their fight for the rights of women, and they were actually the first in the West to have the ability to vote before it became law in government later on in the 1920s with the 19th Amendment. In conclusion, the post-Reconstruction years brought a new series of conflicts over growing power of the wealthy railroads and corporations. While Western families and entrepreneurs seized Native American land and culture, Native American women like Zicala Za spoke up against these injustices. Other women spoke up against injustices of the corporation of corporate power and combined their efforts with the fight for women's right to vote.